Morning. Thanks once again for joining me as we continue our discussion in Philippians. We've been discussing anxiety over the last few weeks. We're in the fourth lesson of five, so we're almost at the end of this look at Philippians and what Paul has to teach us about anxiety and stress. I think it's probably safe to say now that we've been in this quarantine, social distancing, whatever you want to call it, we've been in this for a number of weeks now. I think for myself a lot longer than I had originally anticipated. It's safe to say, as we've gone through this, that we all have varying levels of anxiety, and I think that's probably shown itself in the way that we deal with this pandemic too. I was in a grocery store the other day, and they had these arrows going up and down the aisle, and I had mistakenly gone down one of the aisles the wrong direction. I hadn't noticed the arrows, and there was a lady there very quick to point out to me that I was doing it wrong. And then I saw this same lady go down another aisle, and I guess she found somebody else that was doing it wrong too, and she pointed out to them that they were doing it wrong. And the other lady maybe was not so patient as perhaps I had interacted with this lady, and she got quite upset. And when the lady left, she had her back turned, and the other lady that she had just scolded ran up behind her and scared her, and like came up really close to her. It was very bizarre, something I hadn't experienced at a grocery store before. It's safe to say that some of us are feeling quite anxious about the times that we're in, and maybe some of us are a little bit less so. So while it's shown itself in that way, in the way that we're dealing with this pandemic, I think that's true in all situations. We all deal with stress and anxiety differently, and we have varying degrees of anxiety and stress. The one thing I think we all do have in common, though, is that we will deal with moments of anxiety. For some of us, you could even say it's chronic, and for others, we deal with it intermittently, depending on what the situation is and the circumstances that surround us. But it is safe to say that all of us deal with anxiety. I do have one quick hint for you. I was told the other day that when you see these arrows up and down the grocery store aisle, a friend of mine had saw a lady that simply went down the aisle backwards. She pulled her cart backwards down the aisle instead, so she could go against the arrows, I suppose. So maybe you can try that. I don't know if that works. You can try that if you'd like. So we're going to continue with our lesson in Philippians. We're in Philippians chapter 4, so you can turn there if you haven't already. Philippians chapter 4, starting at verse 4. And before I get into today's lesson, we'll very quickly review some of the things that we've been talking about. So we've discussed how anxiety and stress are things that we all deal with, which is what I had just mentioned. We also talked about how we are not supposed to, find ways to avoid all sorts of stress and anxiety in our lives. If we went through our entire lives with no stress and no anxiety, we're probably doing it wrong. Right? God wants us to push ourselves to do His work. So we will all deal with anxiety, and the purpose of life is not to avoid anxiety. We're all going to face it. The purpose is to build courage and trust in God, so that we can face the anxiety that we're going to encounter. We need to rejoice in the Lord in the midst of these anxious situations, and that doesn't mean that we have to lie to ourselves and lie to God that we are happy about the situation we're in. It simply means that we understand God's presence and His sovereignty in the things that are happening. We also talked about how we need to make sure our gentleness is evident to all. Our reasonableness is the way that my translation mentioned it. So this is the encouragement to us that we should not react emotionally to the situations that we're in, that we need to be level-headed and put our trust in God. We had also discussed the last week that we need to present our requests to God. We need to be in communication with God. And some of the elements that we discussed in our communication with God is that we need to worship God, that we need to make specific requests of God so that we can see His work, and so that we can vocalize and understand the things that we're struggling with, and that we need to pray continually. Today we're going to focus mostly on verse 7, and verse 7 is going to discuss God's peace. So, starting at verse 4, I'm going to read Philippians 4, 4 to 7. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Now, in this discussion of verse 7 and the peace of God, we're going to talk about a few things, but I think one of the key elements here that we see throughout these verses is that if it's kind of like if we do our part, God is there to do His. If we do our part, God is there to do His. So what is our part in all of this, in dealing with anxiety? Well, these are the things that we've been talking about all through the last few weeks. So what are the things that we are responsible for? We are responsible for building in ourselves a gentle spirit. We are responsible for rejoicing in the Lord, praying. We're responsible for praying with thanksgiving. And these things are not done in isolation. These things are done as we build a relationship with God, and He will help us build these things in ourselves. But these are things that we need to actively practice. We need to actively practice being gentle. We need to actively practice rejoicing in the Lord. We need to actively practice prayer. So these are all things that we need to do. And in response to all of these things that we, with God's help, are building in ourselves, God's response is His peace that's available to each and every one of us. So when we do our part, God is quick to do His. He's there to do His part as well. And in talking about this peace, I think it's important to separate maybe the broader understanding of what peace looks like and focus it specifically on the spiritual peace that God can present to us. And I told you that I'm getting a lot of this information and following a study from Max Lucado, and he has a quote in here about God's peace, and I'm going to read that to you. So he says, "Our Father gives us the very peace of God. He downloads the tranquility of the throne room into our world, resulting in an inexplicable calm. We should be worried, but we aren't. We should be upset, but we're comforted. The peace of God transcends all logic, scheming, and efforts to explain it." I really like the way he words this understanding of peace. It's not something that God simply grants to us. He gives us a little bit of peace when we need it. It's that the peace that God brings to us, he says, is downloaded into us. It transcends. God is with us. So it's not peace that He gives to us. God's peace is continually with us as He walks next to us. And it's a peace that defies all logic. A peace that defies all logic. And you're probably thinking in your mind right now of perhaps people that you know that have experienced this kind of peace. And what an amazing tool of encouragement that is. What an amazing witnessing tool that is. To see someone experiencing the peace of God as they walk through a time of trouble. It's something that's always been an encouragement to me, and I'm guessing you probably have experiences like that too. Perhaps it's an experience you've had yourself. So these are some of the things that we're going to discuss over the next little while. So I want us to look at John chapter 14, verse 27. So if you have your Bible, you can turn there. John 14, verse 27. And this is the promise that God gives to us. He promises us, "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid." He promises His peace to us. What kind of peace is this? Well, we discussed a little bit in this quote from Max Lucado what that peace can look like. It's a powerful peace. It's the peace that Jesus displayed when he was brought before Pilate, and he had to stand before Pilate and these crowds of people that were cursing at him. It's the peace that Jesus had as he was being whipped and ridiculed. It's the peace that he had when he hung on the cross. This form of peace can be given to us. It's a peace that defies logic. And if we look at the character of Christ as he goes to his death, we understand very quickly that he had a peace that defied logic. And this is the peace that's available to us. We do our part. He's quick to do his. We just need to lean into him and accept the peace that he has quickly offered to us. Now, when we think about peace, we have to think about the ideas of trust. And trust is something that we have talked about over the last few weeks. And it's easy to see that trust and control are inextricably linked together. Control is something that many of us seek. I think that's kind of in our nature, right? We seek control, and for many of us, giving trust to somebody else is quite difficult. But this is exactly what Jesus wants from us. He wants us to relinquish control and put our trust in him. And our relinquishing of control is a simple acceptance that we understand how the world works. If we understand how the world works, it's very easy to see that we have so little control, and that seeking and grasping at what little control we might have is quite futile. What we need to do is relinquish control and trust in God. This is the practice, these things that we need to practice so that God can grant his peace to us. Many of us are probably familiar with the classic trust fall experiment. You have somebody stand up, somebody goes behind them, and, they usually ask questions like, do you trust this person, blah, 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 and eventually the person is encouraged to simply fall back and trust that the person behind them is going to catch them. And this has often been used as an analogy in the way that God helps us. And it's a good analogy, right? God is there to catch us when we trust him, right? We should trust him. I remember this was many years ago, I had a class that they wanted to make a video about trust fall, but they weren't going to do the trust fall as it's done classically. They were going to put a little bit of a spin on it. So their trust fall experiment was that they were going to walk around the school, and there would be somebody following them with a video camera, and they would simply go up to somebody and they'd say, hey, how's it going? I trust you. And then they'd simply turn around and fall at this person. So it was really funny to see some of the reactions of people. Some people, when they saw the person falling at them, would drop all their books and catch them. Others would jump out of the way and the person would simply fall to the ground. But I think that this is also a way that we interact with God. Yes, he's there to catch us. But how many times do we put God in situations where we test him, right? Or perhaps we seek control. We seek control, and in that way, and in seeking that control, we fall in such a way that we're testing what God is going to do. And I think sometimes we get us into difficult situations. Sometimes we fall, right? Sometimes we put ourselves into situations where we do actually fall. But it's important to remember that even when we do these stupid things, that God is there to pick us back up again. But this all relates to the idea of the trust that we have in him. Now, if we look at the story of Paul in the book of Acts, where Paul is on this journey. He's been arrested, but he's on this journey to go to Rome, and he wants to meet Caesar. And so he's on this journey to Rome. He's on a ship. It's taking many, many days, and they land. I think it's on the south island of Crete, and they realize very quickly that winter is coming, and they're not going to get to Rome in time. So they're going to have to weigh anchor there and stay in the city for winter. But the sailors don't really want to. And it's not, I don't think it's really exactly clear why it is that they don't want to, but they decide that they want to sail off to Phoenix instead, I think is the place. So if you turn to Acts chapter 27, starting at verse 9. Acts 27, starting at verse 9. And we see they want to sail off to Phoenix, and Paul warns them that they should not do this. He says in Acts 27, verse 9, "Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, 'Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives.' But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter, the majority decided to put out to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there." So Paul warns them about this decision that they're about to make. We need to stay here. And Paul at this time is a seasoned sailor. He spent a lot of time on the sea. But they don't listen to him. They decide to risk it. They decide to take a chance. And we see very quickly through this story that they get caught in the storm, and the ship is lost eventually. And all of them survive, and they land on this island. But it's interesting, Paul's reaction to this. And we get Paul's reaction to these events and the storm that they've been going on in verse 21. "Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood among them and said, 'Men, you should have listened to me and not set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of God, to whom I belong and to whom I worship. And he said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God had granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island.'" So Paul says to them, he rebukes them. He says, "See, I told you, you should have listened to me. But God, in his mercy, has, decided to spare our lives, and we're going to be saved." And they land on this island. They are in fact saved, and they eventually, after the winter has departed, they're eventually able to set sail again. And I think this is true in our relationship as well too. Sometimes we make very stupid or difficult decisions. We make a poor decision, and we need to be rebuked. We are rebuked, or we recognize the error. God picks us back up again, and we're able to move forward. Something else that is quite interesting about this story is that we looked at a story about a ship on the sea and the storm last week in the book of Matthew. We looked at Matthew chapter 14. This is where Jesus walked on the water, and something that wasn't mentioned when we discussed that was so the disciples are out on the water. It's very stormy. Jesus is praying. It says the disciples went out around evening, and that Jesus went walking out onto the water about the 4th watch of the night, I believe it was. So what this means is that the disciples had been out on the water for hours and hours and hours. 4 to 6 hours they had been on the sea. Much of that time, it's reasonable to assume, was in this storm. So why didn't Jesus, right when the storm started and the disciples recognized the situation they're in, why didn't Jesus immediately come to them walking on the water and calm the storm? He was there praying for hours as the storm kept battering these disciples on the water. Hours and hours and hours, and then finally he comes and he helps them. In this story of Paul, they're on the sea not for hours but days and days. They're in this storm thinking they're going to die. Why wasn't this vision given to Paul sooner? Why were they on the storm for that long? And these aren't answers that we can immediately come to for every situation that we deal with, but it is safe to say that we often go through struggles that we think are too long. And in those struggles, I think we often believe that God is far away, when in fact, in those struggles, God can be right next to us, and maybe we don't recognize it. This is the part where we do those things that God has given to us, that we've looked in Philippians, being gentle, praying with thanksgiving, rejoicing in the Lord. We do these things in moments of struggle, and He is there to grant us His peace. Sometimes we don't recognize that He's right next to us. Now, what about those times in our lives where it seems like the stress and anxiety that we're dealing with is not of our own making? It's not something stupid that we've done, but in fact, it seems quite random. There was a study in Science magazine, I think it was from 2015. In this study, these researchers discovered that that sometimes cancer, the way that people get cancer, can seem almost completely random. So they said that approximately 2/3 of all cancers are the result of what they coined as biological bad luck. It's simply the idea that some people's in some people's bodies their cells split and their cells regenerate in different ways, and the more often that the cells regenerate, the more chance there is of some kind of mutation and for a cancer to invade those cells. And it seems completely random. It could be somebody that didn't smoke. You followed all the directions of the various centers for disease, and you end up with cancer, and it seems almost completely random. It's definitely not of your own making. I think we're all know stories that seem all too familiar. So what happens in moments where it seems that this is completely random and it's not of our own making? Where is God, or where is that peace in those moments? What kind of promises are made to us? And I think that even Jesus wrestled with this, right? He says before he goes to the cross, God, take this cup from me. Right? Even he wrestled with the idea of, what was to come. But he faced it anyway. And I think that we live in an age where, there's a lot of uncertainty, and sometimes it seems like some things are completely random. But Jesus extends to us, the invitation to willfully accept the things that befall us. Because we trust Him, we can face the things that we feel like we can't. And this, I think, is where we get to this element in verse 7, where at the end of this verse, let me turn back there quickly. At the end of verse 7, it says that the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard our hearts and minds. This is the peace that defies logic. Only with His peace can we accept the things that befall us. It's only with His peace that we can have this willed acceptance of the struggles that we're dealing with, the anxieties that we're struggling with. So we need to place our trust in Him. We need to relinquish control and place our trust in Him. We need to make sure that we are rejoicing in Him, that we are being gentle, that we are in prayer, that we're praying with thanksgiving. We need to do all of these things so we can accept His peace and have a peace that defies logic, a peace where others look at us and they have difficulty understanding how it is that we face the things that we're facing. Now, the last element of this verse is this idea of guarding your hearts and minds. God promises that He's going to guard our hearts and minds. And what exactly does this look like? And it's this idea that as we trust Him, He takes responsibility for our hearts and minds. It's part of the peace that He gives to us. So as we do these things, God is there to present His peace to us, and He builds a barrier in our hearts and minds, and we're able to thwart the attacks of the devil and the things that are that we're struggling with. It's safe to say that for somebody like Paul, who's writing this, he could have spent much of his time dealing with guilt as he worked for God's kingdom. He dealt with all sorts of anxieties, but we don't get a lot of this anxiety that came from guilt. Remember, he was a persecutor of the church. There was blood on his hands. But we don't see Paul saying in these letters that, he did these horrible things and I can't move forward. I can't do the things that God has placed before me because of the things that I've done in my past. And these are the ways that the devil attacks us. You're not good enough. You don't have the skills and abilities to do the things that are set before you. You can't face this because you're all alone, right? These are the things that the devil attacks us with. But when we place our trust in God and God brings his peace to us, he guards our hearts and our minds against those types of attacks. And I think that's really important for us to remember, that in the stress and the anxiety that we face, we are continually attacked, and the only way to guard against those attacks is with God. Now, what areas in your life do you think perhaps you need to find ways to give up control? What areas of your life are you seeking control and you need to put more trust in God? In what areas do you need to recognize that you didn't listen and that you're in need of help? Maybe you're in trouble and it's of your own making. In what areas do you need to recognize this and put more trust in God? How are you being attacked right now? Perhaps you've left your heart unguarded. In what ways are you being attacked right now and you need the peace that God is able to give to you? I think it's important to remember that this peace that we can experience is not a secret. It's not something that we need to really search for and find. It's there for us. It's not a secret. It's a person. And if we put our trust in that person, in the person of Jesus Christ, he's able to grant us the peace that we need to get through the anxieties and the stresses and the difficulties that we've been going through. It was just this week that Ravi Zacharias passed away, and many of you, I've been looking on social media, have indicated this, and there's been a great outpouring of grief due to his passing. He meant a great deal to a lot of people, and for those of you that maybe don't know who he is, he was an evangelist and an apologist for the gospel. You can look up his videos; they're all over YouTube. So Ravi Zacharias passed away just this last week, and it came on very quickly. I was listening to something about his final days, and he had back trouble, and I think it was late January, February, he had back trouble. They went in and they found that he had cancer, and less than 2 months later, he was gone. It was incredibly sudden. And one of the people that was at his bedside when he passed away said that he had told him that, at the age of 17, he had attempted to kill himself, and that God had spared him, and that in that moment when he was spared, a Bible was given to him. He gave his life to God, and God gave him over 50 more years. Isn't it interesting how a simple change of perspective can totally change the way that we look at a situation that we might find ourselves in? So over the course of this next week, I'm going to encourage you to do the things that we find in Philippians chapter 4. Do those things that we are responsible for. Being gentle, rejoicing, praying with thanksgiving. Do these things so that God can grant his peace to you in those difficult situations that we find ourselves in. And hopefully, you are going to be able to find a peace that transcends all understanding. A peace that defies logic, so that you can continue to face the difficulties that you are facing and that you are going to face. Thanks once again for joining me, and we'll see you next week.